Face the Nation's Margaret Brennan sat down with Vice President Mike Pence after a rocky week at the White House. On Wednesday, the New York Times published an anonymous op-ed allegedly written by an administration official who claimed members of the Trump administration are part of a resistance against the president. Vice President Pence gave two responses on this after he asked to clarify his original answer. Take a listen.
So you don't think anyone on your staff, since they're calling themselves a Trump appointee, had anything to do with this?
I wouldn't know, and I really would hope not. And I was heartened to see so many of our colleagues make it very clear that they weren't involved in this in any way. Look, I can tell you, serving alongside this president is an incredible privilege for me, and I know it is for every member of our cabinet and all the senior personnel in our administration. I mean, this is a president who literally gets up every day and works to keep the promises that we made to the American people. And when you look at the record of success over the last 18 months, it's truly been remarkable.
Mr. Vice President, I asked you earlier if anyone on your staff wrote this op-ed. Have you asked your staff?
Oh, well, I thought you were speaking about the administration staff. Let me be very clear. I'm 100% confident that no one on the Vice President's staff was involved in this anonymous editorial. I know my people, Margaret. They get up every day and are dedicated just as much as I am to advancing the president's agenda and supporting everything that President Trump is doing for the people of this country.
And so, you asked them?
Well, honestly, I don't have to ask them because I know them. I know their character. I know their dedication. And I am absolutely confident that no one on the Vice President's staff had anything to do with this. But that being said, whoever this was, they should do the honorable thing and resign.
Face the Nation moderator Margaret Brennan joins us now. So, Margaret, what happened when the cameras were off and the Vice President asked to clarify his answer? Why did he feel he needed to clarify?
Well, this was one of the very first questions that we began our interview with. Who do you think was behind the anonymously entitled New York Times op-ed? Then I said, are you sure it wasn't anyone on your staff? Because they identify as a Trump political appointee. The vice president answered, we moved on. In both cases, he said, I don't know, essentially. After the conclusion of the interview, because we covered many other topics, the vice president came back and said he wanted to clarify because he misunderstood the question, thinking it was generally about Trump political appointees, not his staff. And so specifically, we followed up on that. He wanted to make clear that in his view, no one in the vice president's office, no one who worked for him directly, was behind that op-ed. However, when I asked him if he'd actually put the question to his staffers, he said he didn't need to do so. He spoke about it as a matter of character rather than one that he had come to as a conclusion by questioning those working around him. So it was something, though, that the vice president felt he wanted to have on the record clearly that he, at least, is lending his vote of support to his staff, and he says he's 100% confident they're not behind it.
We also spoke to Senator Mark Warner, the vice chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, and he said there are, quote, absolutely no national security issues with the New York Times op-ed. How should we understand this disagreement between Senator Warner and the Trump administration here regarding this issue of national security?
Well, this goes back to a conversation President Trump had on Air Force One with reporters. And when he was asked, do you want the Justice Department to investigate what should happen, who's behind it? He said it's something that Jeff Sessions, the Attorney General, should look into because it has to do with national security. He didn't specify exactly what he meant by that. For the Justice Department to launch an investigation, you would have to have some justification as to whether there was confidential or classified information, some wrong, some illegality that was committed here. And it's not clear at all that that's what happened. You've heard others around the president, like the vice president, try to clarify and say, well, this really may have more to do with the idea that the president thinks or suspects that the person leaking this information may come from within the national security establishment. So this goes back to the lack of clarity around what the president actually meant during that Air Force One Q&A. But Senator Warner was saying on the matter of this being a legal issue, from his perspective on the Senate Intelligence Committee, there's no justification for using the tools of the Justice Department to try to suss out who is behind this or to kind of prosecute anyone if they do accuse anyone by name.
Margaret, back on the vice president, in your interview, Vice President Pence said he would be willing to speak with special counsel Robert Mueller if asked. Here's what he said.
Has he asked for an interview with you yet?
With the Mueller investigation. He has not, although we've provided any and all information, and we'll continue to do that.
Then you'd be willing to sit with him if he were to ask?
I would be more than willing to continue to provide any and all support in that. And we have outside counsel that will advise me accordingly. But I just have to tell you, Margaret, it's just not been my focus. And it's not the president's focus.
All right, given that President Trump has not expressed that same kind of willingness, on Friday, for instance, he said he did not, quote, want to be set up with a perjury trap. Was the vice president's answer surprising in any way?
Well, it's interesting that we are that far along that the special counsel is trying to engage the president's attorneys and hasn't spoken yet or even asked to speak yet with the vice president. That's perhaps suggestive of either where they are in the investigation or the priorities of the special counsel himself in terms of the questions not just about Russian election meddling or tampering during the election, but also the obstruction of justice charge there. Remember, Vice President Pence became part of this narrative, became part of this story because he came out and vouched for National Security Advisor Michael Flynn on this very program to my colleague John Dickerson, backing up what we now know to be false statements that Michael Flynn provided to the FBI about whether he had spoken to Russian officials about lifting sanctions prior to inauguration as some sort of suggested dissuading Vladimir Putin from responding to the Obama administration, which was still in office. So the vice president's part of the story. It's interesting that at this point he says he is not part of the probe and hasn't asked to be, but he is willing to comply with it.
And Margaret, what's your take on the vice president saying that the Russia investigation has not been his or President Trump's focus at this particular moment?
Well, we know for President Trump, he makes clear what is his focus on his Twitter feed and what he speaks about publicly. So it is very much front of his mind. So the vice president perhaps not being as candid as we know the president is in that characterization. But the vice president is reflective of what many in the administration voice in terms of frustration, which is they want to talk about policy. They want to talk about their accomplishments. And yet these developments in the investigation and questions about it continue to muddy their message and continue to undercut whatever it is that they would like to be boasting about. So that's why the vice president was making that pivot.
Well, the vice president also responded to Bob Woodward's upcoming book, Fear, Trump in the White House, which contains some very critical accounts of the Trump administration. The vice president said, quote, "The only thing that's wrong about that narrative is everything." And you attempted to go and get very specific to try to have the vice president respond. What is your sense of that sort of blanket denial? I don't know if we can call it that, but essentially saying that there is nothing that is true about this particular account.
Well, this is why the documentation that Bob Woodward, who is a legendary reporter for the Washington Post, why the documentation, the recordings, all the actual hard homework he has will become that much more important. This isn't a he said, she said. This has to do with reporting that Bob Woodward is putting forward. The vice president was saying, I'm not going to speak on those specifics. He refused to do so when we brought some of them up. But he said, in terms of the characterization of chaos within the White House, that the advisors around the president are essentially trying to protect the country from him, from his worst instincts. That, he said, was patently untrue. He also flatly denied that he personally had any conversations about invoking the 25th Amendment, which would begin a complicated process that's never been used before to remove a president from office. This was an allegation made in that anonymous New York Times op-ed by a self-proclaimed Trump administration official. So the vice president there, that's what he was trying to sort of dismiss. The fact that he engaged on this at all and wanted to speak about it shows you how damaging and upsetting it is to the Trump White House that these reports continue to circulate.
All right, Margaret Brennan in Washington for us. Margaret, thanks, and congratulations on your little one.
Thank you. Wish me luck. I got some work to do beforehand.
Oh, best of luck, Margaret. Thanks.
Thank you.